And now that we have our Windows Server set up and SharePoint installed on it as a standalone development environment, let's get Visual Studio 2013 installed. So I'm assuming that you're able to do this before or that you've run through the process, but we'll just make sure that everything's in place and that you don't see anything unexpected. On this install, I actually have broken out the ISO into a file share. So I'm going to go ahead and just open up the directory, run the install. Again, this is my MSDN license. You need to make sure and do the agree. And just because it helps the guys, it actually does help the guys understand how it's used, I go ahead and leave the Experience Improvement Program clicked. So let's go ahead, just do the install. And you can see here, we're not going to be able to do Windows Store apps because we're actually on Windows Server. And I'm going to go through and turn off a couple of things because we're going to use this just for SharePoint development. I'm going to leave the Office Developer Tools. We're going to leave the SQL Server because we may need to look at that at some point. And the Web Developer Tools helps us with creating additional applications underneath SharePoint if we choose to. And the Silverlight Development Tool because we can actually make Silverlight web parts. We'll leave that one as well. So as you can see, we've got Office Developer Tools, SQL Server Data Tools, Microsoft Web Developer Tools, and Silverlight Development Kit clicked. If you chose to, you could include light switch as well if you wanted to make some apps underneath SharePoint that use light switch. We're just going to move on without that because that's really not best practices to put those underneath, though it is supported. And now we do a system restore point, and Visual Studio will go off and put everything in place for us. So we'll let it run for a bit. All right, now that we've got everything rebooted, let's check and bring up Visual Studio and make sure everything's good to go. If you notice, if you haven't installed Visual Studio 2013 before, you can actually sign in. This is for both for licensing if you're working with Windows 8 or Windows Phone apps. You'll need some development licenses, and this can take care of it. One of the benefits for the developer is that your settings actually follow you around when you're signed in. For right now, let's just go ahead and run without that. And I'm a Visual C# guy, so I'm just going to go ahead and choose the development settings. You can choose whatever you would like. Let's get the Server Manager out of the way, and we'll start up Visual Studio. So we've got our templates for apps and for SharePoint itself. So let's go ahead and get started. So now that we have our development environment set up, let's do something with it. What I'm going to be doing is walking through how to actually create a SharePoint project, how to actually add things to it, implement that inside your SharePoint. We're going to put together a quick little web part and show how to deploy it onto your development environment, do some debugging, and work through all those options. So let's get started on it. First, you'll see that we actually have our templates when we come up into SharePoint. We've got our apps over up at our app templates here. And again, you get a short little blurb. And then our SharePoint solutions. We've looked at apps before, so I'm going to look at the solutions here. Basically, we've got the option of doing everything from empty projects to Silverlight web parts to visual web parts, importing solutions, reusable, doing reusable workflows, and those kind of things. We can also go back and support SharePoint 2010 if you're kind of in that process of looking at 2013, but you've still got 2010 to support, so you've got that option as well. But let's get started with the SharePoint 2013 empty project. Why to choose an empty project? Because while these templates for projects are good, they don't cover everything that you can do, and there's some additional information that you can use. So let's start with an empty project and let's add in those items that we need, and then you can see that we can actually put those projects together and make different features and gather them all together. So leave it as SharePoint project, SharePoint empty project, and OK. and now we get a query. We can select the site and security level for debugging. If we're looking at doing sandbox solutions, then we can actually do things that are remote because we're only working with the client side. We've got some pieces there. But because we're working with solutions, let's go ahead and do the full farm solution. We're on our local machine. We've got administrative access. So let's go ahead and work with the server object model and with all those kind of pieces. So we go in, we deploy as a farm solution, and do our finish. And it's going to take just a moment and set up our project. Just as a note, this is a much, much better experience than we used to have. So you should, if you're new to SharePoint development, you should be very happy that the tools have gotten so much nicer. We used to do a lot of this manually. So you can see the SharePoint project now has our properties as you're used to in references. We also have our features and our packages. So you can actually see that it's coming in. We can see what we're actually gathering in place, and it's generated our strong name key as well. So we've actually got a project. Let's go in. That's kind of nice that it's put together, but that doesn't really have anything useful. So we're going to come in and we're going to add a new item. Okay, now you can see that we've got some additional items that the tools have put in place for us. And I'm going to walk down really quickly just some of the options. We're not going to deep dive into each one of them, but you do need to know they're here because when you're looking at this, you may want some of the different approaches. So you can see we've got a Silverlight web part. Again, Silverlight still available in SharePoint, still one of those options that you can put into place. Drop in, you can support it or build new web parts off of this. A visual web part, and this is basically Farmer Sandbox, you can tell, but you actually can have a designer to go in and help put it into place. The visual part is a lot of it's working with the user controls, with being able to come in and visually kind of see what you're going to be doing. If you're used to kind of an ASP.NET web form solution, this is kind of where you probably need to start. And then the visual web part that you can actually have the full trust. You can actually go into all of those pieces in place. So two pieces, a little bit different on the security part. We've got the web part item that we can add in. This is where we're going to drop into in just a moment. We also have the ability to put a list in. You may ask yourself why a list is part of a Visual Studio package, because there's a couple of things that you might want to do here. You may want to have a list with custom configuration that you want to include as part of your feature or solution. You may want to ensure that as that list is going in, that you have certain business logic happening when it gets created. There's a lot of things in here that packaging in the definition of the list with your solution makes a lot of sense. A lot of times you're looking at the list and kind of taking what's already there and modifying it. This is the ability to make sure that you've got exactly what you need. And then you've got your event receiver. I mentioned that this is kind of the other piece that's really valuable in SharePoint. If you're kind of an old timer with SharePoint and kind of picking up some of the new capabilities, note the event receiver itself is synchronous and asynchronous, so you can actually do blocking calls. You can actually stop things from happening, or you can do kind of the old method of SharePoint, which is notification. Something has happened. If possible, use the notification events. These are much more scalable. They're called, again, asynchronously. You know something has happened, and maybe you can see what's happened. If you don't use the blocking calls unless you really have to, because those can really slow down your system. But those come in. You can actually help how that gets tied in. You got your content type. If you're working with SharePoint content type, now these are your, you can actually, again, package it up just like you would with the list. Put it in your feature or solution so that you know that if you're, when you get installed, that you've got everything you need right there, that everything's configured exactly the way you want. Inside of Visual Studio, you actually have the workflows, and you notice we have actually three types of workflows: the generic workflow, the sequential workflow as a farm solution only, and the state machine workflow, which is, again, farm solution only. These are different ways to put your workflows in. We kind of talked about the workflows in the SharePoint Designer section, so I'm not going to go too deep into that, but I do want to call out that Visual Studio is where those actions come into play. It's the activities, maybe conditional, maybe an action. If you need something that's custom to your organization, this is where you put those into place. So you'll actually come in, you'll have your object model to be able to make calls external to your SharePoint site, being able to understand the model state, being able to pick up that metadata associated with the workflow and be able to put your own custom activity in there. This is very, very valuable. I mentioned it in the SharePoint Designer section that you could do that. Here's where you go into it, and so if you're interested in this, a little deeper dive is very valuable. There's the business data connectivity model. Most times when you're working with the business connectivity management tools, you actually are going to have the tools you need. There's a lot of pieces in there with direct database access. There's a lot of in there with working with XML type data. But if you do need something different, if you've got something that maybe is using an ancient IPSIDIC gateway, or you're doing something where you're doing some direct translation between the different systems, this is where you can go in and tell the system how to access that external data source so it can connect in with the business connectivity services. So know that this is in here as well. We've got empty elements, just to have that empty SharePoint element. Application pages, if you actually want to go in and create new application pages inside your solution, you package it in here, you put it in place. Maybe you could even have designed it someplace else, but you can drop it into here. Again, with the site column, same as the content types or the lists, you have those in place. The modules, again, just having those modules in place to be able to organize. Site definition is one of those that's interesting, because a lot of times you'll actually put a custom site definition in for your solution or feature. You're going in and saying, I need a custom subsite that has all these different properties, or may have setups, or may even be pulling in information from outside of SharePoint or metadata associated with SharePoint. So this is where you can put that definition in. So when people go in and say, I want a new whatever, you can have that custom definition already registered, already in place, being able to roll in and out with those properly managed tools. So now that you've got all of that in place, and the user control as a farm solution, if you're just doing a straight user control inside of SharePoint, you don't want it as a web part, you actually just want it onto those application pages, you've got that capability here as well. Note that it does need to be a farm solution because it is running on the server. So we kind of run through those very quickly. If any of these seem interesting to you, definitely do a deeper dive. The documentation, we could spend many, many hours on each one of these, but let's just go straight into a very simple web part and put that together on your SharePoint site. And we want to do a list web part. I'm just being a little humorous there, but let's go through and make our list web part. It'll take just a second to drop it in place. And you can see that we've got additional references. It puts everything in place for us. We've got our capabilities inside of here. We've got everything packaged. We've got our list web part with our elements, our CS file, and all the details. So it's done a lot for us. It's put everything in place. It knows what we've got. It's done a little bit of help with those kind of pieces. But it drops us right into our CS file. So to begin with, I'm just going to put in a little bit of context. So what I want is my So the first thing I did was I want a reference to my SP web object. If you saw as I was typing, the IntelliSense was showing me that there is an SP site object and an SP web object. If you're new to SharePoint development, this is one of the pieces that you can get your veteran chops is when you're discussing with people a site or a site collection. Generally, an SP site is your site collection, and an SP web is a site. It sounds a little bit odd. It's one of those pieces historically we've kind of gotten into. But as we're coming into place, basically what I'm doing is getting a reference to the site that I'm on right now. Whatever site that this web part's going to be on, I've got it just pass it the context, and it'll get me back the correct object. So on this site, at the lists, and what I want to do is, let me go through and find my piece here. Actually, let me back up just a moment. There is a feature here, list for current user. I'm going to set this to true. What this does, this is part of the object model, I'm going to say that I just want to see the list that the current user can see. This makes things a lot easier on security, so you can actually say that the user actually has at least view rights on these lists, so you're not walking through things and you're not worried about lists that the user that are there, but this user doesn't have any rights to. It helps out with some of the security pieces on it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just put a I'm going to get this web and the lists and the count. Simple enough. And then just a simple empty string, and then we'll go through and take a look at that. Let's get a collection of all the different lists. We've got the count, and then we'll do and then add the list dot title. Always make sure we get a toString, and I'll have a comma at the end, but I can deal with that. Now let's do a text box. Text box. So we're going to get a text box to put our count. And we'll put our count in there, and then we'll do a our count into the controls, and then we'll do one more for our list of lists. So and do just the same thing. You can see how just typing along, I get my IntelliSense, I get it on the SharePoint object model, and everything's running fine. So very, very simple web part. We've got it in place. We just take a look at how many lists are in there, and then we go through and iterate through the number of, get the names of each of them. So let's go ahead. One of the nice things with this development environment is we can just say start. It'll compile it, let me know if there's any errors, so far everything's okay, and then it'll take us to the default SharePoint site. We set it up with, that was what it was asking us when we came through here. Now note that I have not gone to that site yet. because we just put together this dev environment. So when we go there, it should ask us for a template that we want to use. And when we go into that, we'll set it up for just a standard team site template. And then we'll be able to put this in place. Oh, yes, yet again, we haven't gone there yet. So SharePoint itself is not configured for debugging. Visual Studio has noticed that. We can run without debugging, but let's go ahead and just say that let's go ahead and modify the web config to allow us to debug. We're on our dev environment. We're not going to be in production, so we can go ahead and do that, but it's letting us know what our options are. Again, very tight integration from the tools to the environment, and away we go. It'll take just a moment for it to get connected, do our update, and then bring up the site. So let's give it just a second as we spin up all of the SharePoint pieces and get to our site. It'll open the website. So you're launching Internet Explorer, whichever your default web browser is on your platform. Right here it is. I'll go ahead and open up a bit. Again, we're running it first time since Visual Studio was installed, so we're going to enable the test recorder. And let's let everything roll. And we're asking for, because it's the first time on this site collection, and I'm going to have it remember my credentials because, well, again, it's my box and I don't really need to have it jumping around. Pop back over, and let's let it come up and show me my site, which is going to be blank and looking for a template. So it's just going to take a second. And here we are with our team site. You can choose one of the others if you want to. The developer site to build and publish apps for Office. This is where you'd go for your apps if we were doing that. But let's go with just a standard team site. Simplifies things just a little bit since we're working specifically with solutions. And tell it OK. And this should be familiar if you've done anything with Office 2013. Working on it, this shouldn't take long as it applies the template, so we'll let it work for just a minute. And now it's asking for the groups. We'll come in and we'll just take all the defaults. And here we have our site. So you notice we have our site, but we don't have a web part in it. That's because SharePoint doesn't know where to put it in, but we do know that it's there. So how do we work with this? We go in, we edit the page. And we're going to go in and insert. And it's going to be a web part. And because it's our web part, it's going to be custom. Come in and we see our SharePoint project list web part, excuse me, and we're going to add it to rich content. This is where we've got the content on the page itself. So we go in and add, and I'll take just a moment, and we'll find out if we've made a good web part or not. So you can see we've got 19 lists, and we can look at our part here and see what we've got. Let's go ahead and save. And now we've created a web part and we've added it to it, and we can scroll through here and see all of the different lists that we have access to. That doesn't mean that we've got rights to be able to read and write. We could actually go back and have this web part go through and find out the different properties, the different rights we have on each one of those. But that's just kind of a nice little way to go in. So we've got it deployed. So how can we actually go through if we had any trouble, if we were worried about how everything happened? Let's go through and put a breakpoint. As developers, breakpoints are always incredibly useful. So we go in and let's refresh the page, which means we're going to render our part again as it goes through. And note that we're working with the web part in SharePoint, and we go through and do a break in our source code. So you can actually come through here and see that where's our stack. We've got a live event. We can actually see how we got to this point. all the pieces that came into place. And because we're actually working with the IntelliSense and with all the debuggers, we can actually go through and see the details. Our list, we've got our alert template. We can actually see all the objects on this object. So we can see list data. There are 6 items in this. We can actually see the default approval workflow. We don't have any content approval. We don't have anything there, so we can see that. We can see where the views are. We can actually go through and look at huge amounts of information off of all of this. So if you're one of those people like I am that kind of go in and let's take a look and let's poke at it a bit, you can actually go through, see all the details. If we had any event receivers, we could actually check here. We can actually go through and get access to all kinds of information off of all of our objects. We can actually go back off of our main this web. You can see it's our home is this web. We can actually see all the information off of that, the masks, the permissions, the anonymous accesses, all of those kind of pieces that we've got. If we had an app, it would show that we could show the database name. We can actually go in and really dig through all of the information here. We can do breakpoints. If you're working with Sharepoint, you can see just how you can dive in and know exactly what's happening with whatever extension that you're working with. As I mentioned before, why would you kind of go through all of the complexity and the detail of putting in your Sharepoint development environment when you could actually do an app model, or you could actually do Sharepoint Designer? This is why. Being able to go in, put all of your code in place, being able to see all of the properties, be able to debug, being able to really get a full and complete view of what's happening inside your Sharepoint environment. So there we have it. You've actually gone through, created a very simple Sharepoint web part, put it up on to your development environment, run it, done a breakpoint, done some debugging, and now you've gone through the cycle. You can actually tie this in with your Team Foundation server if you wanted to for the application lifecycle management. All this is available inside there. In the next module, we'll actually look at packaging this up, how you can actually put it so you can pass it off to operations, and how operations would actually deploy this into production environments. But that's going to be in the next module. For now, we've gone through our exercise here with our Sharepoint demo, and hopefully you have found it useful.